Good afternoon and welcome to this last program in a series that the Nolambika Project has presented throughout 2020. We call it River Stories 2020, Recovering Indigenous Voices. We hope that you will enjoy the next few hours of conversation. But first, we must acknowledge that all of us are living on lands, we're benefiting from lands that were seized, taken, stolen through trickery or violent means by the colonial settlers. This is the homeland of the Pecumtuck and associated historical tribes, the Nonotuck, Norwatuk, the Woronoko, and Agawam, among many other tribes. Their descendants, their spirits, and their descendants and members of the Nipmuc, Abenaki, Wampanoag, Narragansett are still here living among us on their ancestral lands. We join them in seeking to heal and restore these lands and working together for justice and peace for the next 7 generations. A quick word about the people who are making this possible and who have helped us through the years, but in particular in the River Stories 2020 series. First and foremost, the Babson 2020 Fund of the Peace Development Fund. The Greenfield Savings Bank, a local bank that has helped us in many of our efforts and many of our programs. The Northeast Solar Group. The River Valley Co-op. And a shout out to Rochelle and her associates who have spearheaded an effort to preserve an early archaic site uncovered near their store during the construction of a rotary in Northampton. We are really grateful to Rochelle and her efforts and all of those who follow this event. Through their efforts, and their petition, they have garnered 55,000 signatures in support of preservation of this site, which is just amazing. I also want to recognize Diane Dix, who modestly will decline to be recognized, but she is retiring after being our volunteer events coordinator ever since Nolambika Project was first founded. She is behind the organization of the 7 years of the Pecumtuck Homelands Festival, the events, the 3 events that we provide each year. So Diane will be missed. I don't know what we're going to do now. Another announcement, we are recording this, so you need to know that. And when the question and answer period will happen towards the end of this program, you have in front of you a raise hand feature that you should use during the question and answer, and the technician will unmute you. Now it gives me a great honor and a lot of pleasure to introduce our first speaker, a longtime ally of the Nolambika Project, even before we were Nolambika Project. I consider Doug the guiding authority on ceremonial stone landscapes in the Northeast. He is active in the preservation of sacred sites. He was a key player in the successful preservation of the Ceremonial Hill in Turner's Falls that the Department of Interior and the National Park Service recognized as an important ceremonial site, the first time that has happened this side of the Mississippi River, and Doug was a good part of that. Doug was also a co-founder with myself and Paul Robinson, the retired state archaeologist of Rhode Island, in forming the National Park Service Battlefield Study Advisory Board, studying the massacre at the falls in 1676. I could go on and on. Doug is a diplomat and a distinguished representative of Indigenous people. So, Doug, it's all yours. Thank you.
Well, I thank you. It is an honor to be a part of this program, and I give thanks to Creator and the ancestors for making this day and my presence in this program possible. I'm going to deal with two themes, all under one heading. It's the theme of debt. First, how I owe a debt of gratitude to one person who has just become an ancestor in this region, and a story of debt as it has its other face, debt based in greed. And look forward to sharing that with you. The debt of gratitude. If we can show the image of Frances Crowe. Frances, at her 100th birthday, became an ancestor. And I'm sure that those welcomed her. I think we can tilt Frances up just a little. There we go. Frances Crowe. Frances was one of the protesters at the Sandisk field protest. If we can show her as she is better known as having been arrested from her wheelchair. She was, I think, probably about 96 or 97 at that point. But she was still protesting and spending her latter years doing what she had spent much of her life doing, which was shining a light on issues that needed public acknowledgement and addressing. And here are the state troopers who are about to arrest her. And I'm told that when once before asked by a police officer, how many times have you been arrested? She said, not enough. And I think that that is a reply that all of us would be honored to offer. Not enough. Not enough times arrested so that the ills that I stand against have ceased to be. But that's Frances Crowe. The last image I think we have of Frances shows her being wheeled into the police vehicle. And we should take a look further at some of the other people who participated in the protest, because the people of Sugar Shack Alliance were crucial to making sure that the public knew what was going on at Sandisk Field. The National Historic Preservation Act addresses the state, the tribes, and the public as being parties who can step forward and protect ancient cultural resources. And I must say that they do not spell out how the public shall do that, but I could not think of a better way than to raise the public's voice, not only in written articles, but in protest. And so here you have people of the Western Massachusetts area standing and protesting the impact of the ceremonial stones and the gas lines that were coming through. So thank you to the people of Western Massachusetts especially. And I have a special thanks because when I call to the ancestors, we call both past and future. For those who are yet to come, who will become ancestors. And I asked, what shall I do? Shall I take this hard stance of going toward federal court? And the word that came back was, you will be held responsible for whatever you do. So choose wisely. And so I went into the battle. And the attorney for that was Anne Marie Gardy. And her words translated what the tribe and multiple tribes had to say. I owe a debt of gratitude to Frances Crowe for standing in her latter years and letting everyone know that you don't have to be young and radical to have your voice heard. You can be in your 90s, and as she was, into 100, and have her voice heard, her protest heard. And I can't even begin to imagine what the state trooper had to say to his family when they asked, so Dad, what did you do today? Mm-hmm. Well, I picked up an old lady who was in her wheelchair and put her in jail. What would an old lady have to protest? But she did, and we thank her for standing firm. I was one of the tribal people who had to walk the gas line and see if there were ceremonial stones or anything else that might be impacted by the work that they were going to do. And ultimately, what happened was that we identified a multitude of ceremonial stones, and a number of them were impacted. And it was the fault of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that impact occurred. The Federal Regulatory Commission, FERC, should have stopped it. We identified what was there, we mapped what was there, and they were informed, and they chose to step aside and allow the destruction to occur anyway. At any rate, debt. My debt of gratitude to our elder sister. I hope I have begun to pay it. But there is then the debt of greed. And that begins the story of Mashalisque, who was the woman chief, the Sunk Squaw or one of the women chiefs, Sunk Squaws of the Pecumtuck people. And she had a son. And Mashalisque, in order to protect him from being enslaved by John Pynchon, or at the behest of John Pynchon, ended up turning over lands of the Pecumtuck people to John Pynchon because of debts owed by her son. And John had an outpost where he sold to people. John had an outpost. Well, it's not clear what all he sold to people, but we do know that there were 3 cider mills that John Pynchon ran. And we know that Mashalisque's son was a drinker. And so it is at the hands of the man who makes the cider, that he was projected to be a slave. And his mother, in order to keep him from being chained and sent off on a ship into the Caribbean or wherever the ship would have taken him, turned loose certain lands to pinch on that were Pocumtuck lands. And so my question would be, the wealth that the Pynchon family acquired, did they do so by good debt or bad? Those are things that we must find out. There are many of you who are listening to this and watching this program who have the capacity to examine the record, to do the research necessary, to determine what lands those were in the area of Deerfield and what happened as a result of those debts being paid. Mashalisque is a name that is probably forgotten by many, but it should be remembered by all. Her spirit is still very strong. I've walked the area. Her spirit is still very strong in the Deerfield area. And we must never forget the footsteps of those who preceded all of us who walk the lands today. And we must ask for their support and also their forgiveness for the things that have happened in the name of the future and in the name of the goodwill of the future. There is a song that one of our associates has crafted to Mashalisque, and I would ask that she sing that.
Thank you, Doug. I'll be ready later to speak at more length about Mashalisque. Mashalisque was her honorific name. We don't know what her personal name was. And the sense was that she spanned this time period that was so difficult. David will be talking more about that, of the change over time. Here is a song to her. We sit in the place where you once were. You walked this mountain, that's for sure. You looked from this ledge, you followed the hawks. You leaned on these beaver tail mountain rocks, and the wind says your legacy must never cease. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. As colonist thievery exploded and climbed, you were one of the Sunsquaws in that turning time. You lit the signal at the mountain top. The ancient fire cannot stop. And where you are, all those who are listening, feel free to sing along. And the wind says your legacy must never cease. I'll do that line again. And the wind says your legacy must never cease. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. John Pynchon claimed a deed must be done If you did not sign it, he'd enslave your son. But no deed, no massacre has the final word. Your full power still is heard. Your full power still is heard. And the wind says your legacy must never cease. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. Speaking for myself and those of us descendants of colonizers, can we learn to be uprisers and take off the blankets of treachery and carry the real history? May we learn and draw near you. Is there a way to hear and see you? And the wind says your legacy must never cease. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. Pecumtuck Sonsqua, diplomat shown, may your life always be known. The great Beaver Mountain greeted you in song. You hold a thread. May this pass on, and the wind says your legacy must never cease. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. We call to the wind your name, Mashalisque. Ooh, oh, Mashalisque, Mashalisque. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Sarah. Mashalisque, her name shall never be forgotten. Her deeds, we weren't there, we don't know, but we do know from the documents that John Pynchon had intended to twist whatever he could to acquire those lands. We are thankful for the debt that we owe Mashalisque and the ancestors past, ancestors present. And I give thanks once again to Frances Crowe for standing firm and showing the Western Massachusetts community what an old lady can do and what those who would look up to her must do. And although the stones were impacted, Western Massachusetts will never forget that it has a responsibility to the ceremonial stone sites that still exist in not only Western Massachusetts, but all over these United States. We must protect the ceremonial stones. And we must acknowledge that the National Historic Preservation Act gives a place to the public for the public to stand with the tribes and stand with the states and protect the ceremonial stone landscapes. We're giving thanks for all things.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. And thank you, Sarah. We'll be hearing a little bit more from Sarah in a few minutes. In this kind of in-between time, uh, my task is to basically kind of be the what would I call it? The pedantic person and kind of talk about Mashalisque in historical context. So if you bear with me a little bit, I just love connecting things together and following the strings of history. So we're going to just talk briefly about how all of this came to be and how Mashalisque's sacrifice, perhaps a sacrifice, perhaps she was way more canny than we have so far discussed. But if you can picture the Pilgrims turning up in 1620 and the Massachusetts tribe, at least according to legend, helping them through the first winters. Well, just a little bit farther to the north, about 10 years later, there was a tremendous, immense migration of Puritans out of England, landed in what we now know as Boston, called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They brought along, perhaps not like the Pilgrims, but they brought along missionaries. And one of the most celebrated or infamous missionaries was John Elliott. Now, John Elliott was here to Christianize Indians, and the only way he felt he could do that would be to get all these Indians in one place, cut the hair, make them wear pants, make them wear shoes, teach them English, and then from there, perhaps learn a trade, but also be, let's say, partners to the English. That turned out very badly for the people who were brought into these praying towns. If you are interested, you could find out by checking out the name Deer Island. Many of these people who were grouped, especially the Nipmuc primarily, were grouped into praying towns, were in dire straits and left to die of starvation during King Philip's War in 1675-76. But what occurred was John Elliott wanted some land for a town and a number of towns, but let's focus on the one in Dedham. So he wanted 2,000 acres of Dedham for his praying town. And what occurred was, of course, the white settlers who had been there for a generation or so discovered that they were going to have to give their land back to the Indians for the Christianizing purposes, and they were not real happy about that. They didn't want to give up their land, and there was a considerable number of court cases, but it turned out that the General Court of Massachusetts in 1663 decided that, yeah, the Dedham people were going to give up 2,000 acres, but the court would give them 8,000 acres out in the Connecticut River Valley, a little bit north of Hatfield. They called it 12 or 14 miles north of Hatfield. Of course, that was Deerfield. They did not really consider the fact that there were about 5,000 Pocumtuck Native people living there at the time. So they needed a man, a land agent, and Doug has mentioned this man, John Pynchon, who was the son of William Pynchon, the founder of Springfield. John Pynchon was a wheeler dealer, entrepreneur. He was a fast talker and capable of all kinds of duplicity. And he was hired by the general court to go out and get the land by hook or by crook to compensate the Dedham proprietors. So he went about, starting in 1663, he went about finding tribal people who would sign over vague boundary lands, vague deeds. And so he went along doing that, and he found a celebrated, infamous man named Chalk, who what George Sheldon called was a convenient dignitary, convenient Indian dignitary. So they got Chalk to sign over lands in exchange for very little few items, cloth coats and beaver skins and all of that. The interesting thing, and you can check this out, I've written a couple of articles that have been published in the Montague Reporter about this. The interesting thing is even Chalk, and despite of his way of signing off lands that he didn't have any title to, he did reserve the usage for tribal people of the land. Of course, the English had no intention of doing that, but Chalk specifically said in his deeds that Native people should be able to come on these lands of what was to become Deerfield, become onto these lands to hunt and fish and gather nuts and all of that kind of a thing. Well, of course, the English concept of private property basically eliminated that possibility once they put up their fences and made it illegal for tribal people to come back onto the lands that Chalk signed away. So there were a number of these kinds of deeds. And when I went looking for Mashalisque, the only references I had were these deeds, 2 or 3 of which she had signed. And we will see why in a couple of seconds. But many of these deeds were signed over by people who didn't deserve to do that. There was an incident that we think Pynchon was responsible for, in that there was a terrible breach of diplomacy in 1664 when a Mohawk prince and ambassador down from the Hudson River, upper reaches of the Hudson River, came down into Deerfield to the Pocumtuck Fort to establish a peace between the two, because the Pocumtuck were as powerful and feared as were the Mohawks. And they had ranged all the way up and down the Connecticut River in dealing with their principal rival, the Mohegans, under Uncas. So at one point, the Mohawks and the Pocumtuck got into a scrap when the Pocumtucks helped their neighbors, the Sokoke, up at Northfield in driving off the Mohawks. Be that as it may, the Mohawk ambassador came into the fort and he never left alive, which was horrific. He was assassinated inside in Deerfield in the Pocumtuck Fort. We have certain documents that show that 2 of Pynchon's agents or henchmen were present during that. So we all kind of feel that Pynchon had a hand in this, because lo and behold, the Mohawks stormed in and through a series of raids managed to scatter the Pocumtuck. They didn't go far. They were not extinct. They were not exterminated, but they stepped out of the way of all that bad energy. So that meant that within a year or so that would have been 1665, Pynchon had free reign, because the Pocumtuck people had moved on. A lot of people had signed away deeds illegally. And you had one person standing in the way, which was Mashalisque. And she was holding out. She was no way was she going to give away her lands. And she controlled her hereditary lands basically from Sunderland and South Deerfield at Wequamps or Sugarloaf north, all the way up through Deerfield on both sides of the river up into Montague. We believe that she also had hereditary stewardship over the falls and Wissatinawag, but that she refused to sign over. As far as we know, there's no deed ever that turned over the falls at Peskiomscut and Wissatinawag to any white entity. More power to her. However, by 1672, so she literally held out almost 10 years, as Doug mentioned, her son, Watawolenskin, for any number of reasons, got himself into Pynchon's debt. As we all know, Pynchon was, as I said, a canny businessman, in quotes, and he managed to create dependencies for Watawolenskin, and he got himself in trouble, as Doug mentioned. So by 1672, to buy her son Watawolanskyn's freedom, to get him back to their home, they lived, according to the history of Montague, they lived on an island called Matam Pash at the mouth of the Sawmill River. Some of you who live in Montague may be familiar with that island, but that is the home where Mashalisque and her son Watawolanskyn and some members of the tribe held on. Be that as it may, by 1672, Mashalisque signed over the lands to get her son out of danger. So I don't want to go too much further. I've given you a lot of information, but I think as an educator myself and a person interested in local history, it's important to know how these current situations, the current lands that we occupy, how this all came about. In doing my research, I had to count on white antiquarian historian George Sheldon, who lived almost to be 100. But to his credit, he copied down a lot of stories passed on by the elders of Deerfield. And he did a lot of legwork and tracked down all these deeds and recorded a tremendous number of indigenous names for these places that we're all familiar with. Just a fascinating record. And Edward Presley, who wrote his history of Deerfield just a few years after him, also wrote down a lot of the oral history. So we have those people to thank in kind of a backhanded way, I guess, and also the records of deeds that can be viewed. So this brings us right up to where I will turn over the rest of the program to Sarah, tell you a little bit about Sarah and what Sarah would like to talk about. And we will have certainly enough time for questions from anyone who wishes to pose some questions. So in talking about Sarah Pirtle, it's a person I've known for a number of years, not for years and years, but way back when she was doing programs at various elementary schools that my son attended. We crossed paths without knowing each other, hardly introducing each other, but I've known Sarah and about Sarah for a long, long time. She's an activist and a songwriter. She's an educator. She has known Frances Crowe for over 40 years. So she's, I hope, going to give us a lot of anecdotal insights to Frances. Sarah's written 5 books about social justice, and she's been recording songs for all ages for a long time. She did write a book called The Outbreak of Peace that received the Olive Branch Award for Outstanding Book of the Year for World Peace. She has run a peace camp, summer camp at Trap Rock Center for 26 years. So she's been around, and she's done a tremendous amount of peace work in the Valley. Sarah shares her new songs on a site called Hope Sings. So enough of my talk about Mashalisque. We're going to go into a more spiritual, ethereal place with Sarah Pirtle. Thanks, Sarah. Here, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you, Doug. So good to be working with you both. What I would like to do next is call awareness of everybody who's listening today and will be listening later, so that all of us are here with a common intention to change colonization, to name it, to see it, to repair. And I also want to say that just to the west, like a few yards from where I'm sitting, is the Pecumtuck River. The colonizer name for it is Deerfield. Pecumtuck means shallow, sandy river. So when I cross it, I like to greet with the old name. And so I also sit here really taking in that I'm on Pocumtuck homeland. And as David was saying, part of the erasure of history was that there were 5,000 Pocumtuck people. And yet when one of the very popular settler books came out, History of Mary Rawlinson, Dr. Lisa Brooks figures that probably what happened is a man named Increase Mather had his hand in making sure she never mentioned the word Pocumtuck. So today our work is really changing that erasure. I want to thank all the people I've learned from. I want to hold up 2 books of Dr. Lisa Brooks, Amherst College. Also call to mind Dr. Margaret Bruchac. She was the one who helped the Deerfield Museums, made sure that Native voices were now raised up. And she's also done a lot of scholarship, taking the things that George Sheldon said, where he begins to erase as if there's, she calls it the vanishing act. Where are the Native people? So she raises up again and counteracts what he said. The third person I've learned so much from is one of the 3 Nolambika founders, Howard Clark, a historian. In his office, he has this scroll that he has made. He's written down the name of every person that he has like 60,000 pages of research. He has them all in chronological order. So I want to bring them all to mind at this moment, that we're opening a door together in this program. And we do it from many different dimensions, thanking many people. So Mashalisque, Frances Crowe. Some of the things they have in common are women defending the land. They are both practical. They were able to inspire many people, and they lived at times of monumental changes. Mashalisque lived into her 80s, and as Doug was saying, Frances lived to be 100. So I'm hoping that people here today, you might be thinking of ways they go together in ways that the 3 of us haven't. So please, bring forward your knowledge as my part ends and we go into question and answer. Okay, it's really significant that this talk is taking place during the week of the Day of Mourning at Pocasset. We have just come through what needs to be called the outrage of Thanksgiving. So starting in 1970, the United American Indians of New England have had yearly gatherings at the site of Coles Hill. This was the 51st gathering. And let's put Mashalisque into this for a moment. So when Mashalisque was about 46 years old, think about this, that would be 1637, Governor Winthrop proclaimed the first official day of Thanksgiving. So let's hear the words of Gail Melix Wampanoag, who grew up in Patuxet. So what she says is, Governor Winthrop did that to celebrate the safe return of men who had gone to Mystic, Connecticut and murdered over 700 Pequot children, women, and men. A mass killing like this had been unknown, not conceived of in the Indigenous world at that time. So I want to take a moment to think for all the Native people reeling from this news. So there she is in the middle of her life. What must have that been like for her? Mashalisque was in her mid-20s during the Great Dying, 1615 to 1619, when 50 to 90% of the Native population, Maine along the coast, died. The whole world was upended. So one of the things that I've learned from Howard Clark is the name John Odom, who arrived in 1614 and probably was carrying in chests sequestered blankets that carried disease. Because Odom and others in Great Britain had studied, well, how did the Spanish take over and how they had used disease. So at that time, that kind of information was not in circulation, but instead there was this great sorrow. So let's go back to the day of mourning and really fully stand in the present day power. I was there in person a year ago, and a friend of mine, Andy Grant, when he thinks about what we're doing today in this talk, he said to me, I think we're here seeking truth for the generations to come. So many people on this call were probably listening online to the live stream of the day of mourning, but let me bring forth the words of one of the co-organizers. She said, we acknowledge the many struggles that all of you bring here today. So that's true for all the listeners. We are all united in our fight against settler colonialism. Only by listening to Indigenous people will we be able to defend and save the earth. And then after her, Samantha Maltese, Aquina Wampanoag, who started #MayflowersKill. Younger voice, important voice. Samantha said, us being here today isn't just about our past. The past isn't in the past. It's also about the present and our future, because as tribes continue to face the impacts of colonialism, we're fighting for our right to self-determination. Last year at the Day of Mourning, people from the House of Mother Earth in Canada came down more than 2,000 miles to be there. I remember hearing Rita say, the last boarding school in that area closed in 1991. Outrage. The flags that's flown at the Day of Mourning, colonize, indigenize, mobilize, organize. So let me speak about my own social location. I'm a descendant of colonizers, as I put into the song. And I want to share with you some of the inner work that I bring, so that, and when I talk about Mashalisque, I want to always be thinking about how this can be respectful. Our family goes back to Kentucky in the 1700s, and my mother's side, East Coast 1600s. So I guess I want to refer to a movie that many people here might have seen this week because it was shown by the Karuna Center, We Still Live Here. It's about Jessie Little Joe Baird and her perseverance to bring back the Wampanoag language. And so we also know that Abenaki and many Native languages are, the language speakers are rising up. But let me tell you this one moment. Okay, Jessie Little Joe Baird is on this perseverance to learn her language and bring it back. And she meets a white linguist from MIT named Ken Hale. And she described, and Jessie says, it bothered me to the core to hear him talking about my language. So I thought, for some people today, witnessing my intense interest and focus on Mashalisque, it could be disturbing to the core. So it's my responsibility to ask these questions of what does it mean to speak? So I've come up with 3 agreements with myself. One is to notice if I'm looking or thinking through a colonizer lens, because Dr. Lisa Brooks, and when I refer to her, many of you may have her books. I want to say you can find this later, page 302. She has this incredible poetic way of talking. She says, we are called to engage in opening the tributaries of our history, not using the replacement narratives of settler colonialism, instead to our collective understanding. So my second agreement is that in speaking about history, like let's take the deeds, to talk about her being forced to sign that deed, but not me guessing what was her feeling, what was she thinking. That interpretation, I believe, should be left to Native people. I think that's really crucial. And a third agreement that I bring to myself is to not mythologize, to try to really see Mashalisque. No, she really lived. So here's something else I'd like to bring forward. I heard a Indigenous woman say, as she was speaking, each person is part of lifting the force that is over this area. Just as David was describing the land theft that rolled through Dedham, and also as he described the massacre in May 1676 at Great Falls, we are all part of lifting that force. And she said, this is about the power of many. So what if we think of ourselves standing in a long line? There was a tradition, as Joe Gravelin has talked, who was also one of the other three founders of Nolambika. He would say that this was like a peace village at Great Falls. For thousands of years, people came, they shared seeds, they had diplomats met, there were treaties. You can imagine all the exchanges, people coming from as far as what is now Ohio. Witamu, in one of the books, there's talking about Witamu looking forward each year to coming to Great Falls. So maybe we are part of a tradition of coming to this river area for exchange. Today, can we see ourselves as part of change and increased understanding? We are part of restoration, a great chain of being, an unbreakable chain. We hold a responsibility now of seeing all the Sunsquaws and the Sachems. I'd like to say 5 more, kind of open 5 doors about Mashalisque before I talk and say 5 things about Frances Crowe. So could we grieve that the way that we know the names of women leaders is because their name was on a colonist deed? I mean, isn't that a source of grieving? One of the things that Dr. Lisa Brooks does is she helps us expand and see more broadly the life of Mashalisque, how she was a cultivator of the land. I'm not saying her personally, I'm saying women were doing this, so let's see her. She was ensuring that there was a distribution network of corn and salmon. She was one of the people who make sure the distribution and sharing knowledge. Maybe she was making sure that certain songs were sung on the Great Beaver Mountain. Maybe she was part of lighting ancestral. So all of these ancestral fires on mountains. So the first thing is, there's a beautiful phrase that Dr. Lisa Brooks says. She says, a world we all inhabit with greater clarity. The second thing is that John Pynchon traded, this is an astronomical number, 4,000 beaver pelts a year. So let's really think about what that was like for her as a sun squaw. And Dr. Brooks calls sun squaw, another meaning would be a rock woman. So the beavers were necessary for the health of the land and the waterways, the health of the ponds. Again, I'm not going to try to interpret, but I want us to look at what that would have meant to have this takeover of the beavers. A third thing, Dr. Marge Bruchac, when she gave a talk recently, a year ago before COVID, the talk was called Before 1704, Wampum Traditions and Landscapes of Memory. She pointed out that reciprocal trade is about everyone contributes and everyone takes. So the way, just as Doug was helping us see this debt, this that Pynchon was bringing people into. So that kind of relationship, if we think about it, it devastated kinship ways. I would love for you to hear some of her direct words. So I'm going to be reading from page 34. There was a deed that recognized Witamu, whose name is also Namumpum, as the sun squaw, the head sachem. It was an official deed. So the English would look at those words and they couldn't see a woman as a diplomat. They couldn't conceive of a Native woman governing in her own right, particularly given that in their hierarchies of race, class, and gender, an Indian woman would rank far below themselves. They were the rock women on whom entire communities relied. They traveled to other Native nations. They carried their communities' decisions. They traveled swiftly to return deliberations. Their collective responsibilities must be seen. So I think what Dr. Lisa Brooks, one of the many things she's offering us is to see this leadership network. So we know Mashalisque's name, but who are the other women whose names we don't know because their names are not on deeds? Let me give you two more things about Mashalisque. If you go to Woolman Hill, so Woolman Hill now is, it's a Quaker center, and its history is really significant. During World War II, a woman named Antoinette Sprite, who is Dutch, she wanted to create a place where people could come from all over the world and stop war, stop future wars. But that was the area that we know from the deeds was a Pecumtuck village area, an area where Mashalisque lived before the second deed is part of bringing her over on the east side of the Quinecticook River. So when you walk on the land that's held in trust, the Quaker land, that's Pecumtuck land at Woolman Hill in North Deerfield. And that's where we hold Journey Camp. So you go along the spine of the Great Beaver Mountain, and there's two magnificent rocks, Doug, that you would love. They're really huge. One is a split rock, and one is a rock, perhaps it's a kettle rock. It's got a basin in it where rain connects. So we can be sure that Mashalisque knew those rocks. We don't know what they meant to her. How did people gather there? But at Journey Camp, we stand at the rocks. And here's a fifth and final question about Mashalisque. So in Our Beloved Kin, we learn that a month before the massacre at Great Falls, 3,000 Native people gathered what is now called Northfield and Vernon, that region. The Sokoke were the hosts. Displaced people from the Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc were there, and other relations. Witimu was there. So was Mashalisque. Well, she was probably around 85. Was she helped to travel? Or did she appoint someone to represent her? Certainly people would have brought back news. So I get excited about placing her with informed guesses into a larger narrative than those terrible moments of being made to sign over the deeds so that her son was not brought to the cabbage plantation that was owned by John Pynchon in Antigua. As we go now to Frances Crowe, let me just take a breath. Frances Crowe and Mashalisque geographically intersect at that place of Woolman Hill. So as a Quaker, Frances was part of helping, and this was before the current group. So this would be like mid-70s, that there would be workshops on nonviolence that was held. And maybe some of you listening today attended those workshops. So then there was a proposal that there be an international center of nonviolence. And that was how Traprock Center for Peace and Justice was intended. She was on the first board. She was part of the selection process. So she helped, we can think of it this way. The kinds of prayers that Mashalisque put into the land, Frances helped make sure continued. I'm just realizing this as I'm saying it. Isn't that exciting? So there was this period in my life when I was probably 30, and I would pray every day to do something to help stop nuclear war. It was because I went on a canoe ride with Frances that changed my life in 1978, and she was telling me how she lived. So I volunteered at Traprock, and one day on the wall at Woolman Hill, there was a notice that said, "This is Pecumtuck land," and the name of the leader was Mashalisque. And I just, So I actually went outside. I went outside and I said, hello, I know you are, I know that you were here. May I have permission to see you and seek you and speak to you? So in that spirit, let's look at an awakening moment for Frances Crowe. Now we go to August 6th, 1945. You'll recognize the date. Frances was ironing at that moment. And let me take a moment to get all the right pieces of paper squarely in front of me. All of the Frances Crowe pieces of paper. Okay. Frances, you can learn about her life through this book. And there's also a website. Finding My Radical Soul is the name of it. And Haley's publishers, Marcia Gagliardi, put this forward, and she wrote it with Marianne DeVita Palmieri, who did interviews. They spent years on this book. So here's this moment where she said almost instantaneously, I was against war. She's ironing comes the news, rushes the streets of my feelings. Where can I find someone who's interested in nonviolence? And so she rushed to a used book for a book. And that action is also part of thousands of people whose lives were changed by talking to Frances Crowe. Next anecdote. A friend said to me, you know, Frances saved my life because during the Vietnam War, what happened is she trained herself to be, to help men become conscientious objectors, the acronym CO. And so she traveled far to get the training. She came back. She told a bunch of people, hey, I'm going to offer this. Nobody attended. I told you she was practical. How can I get people to come to this? Because I have the means to help a lot of men. She used her mimeograph machine. She made flyers. She traveled up and down Route 9 with the flyers ready. Get this. She picked up hitchhikers and she would tell them about what she could offer. A flyer, a ploy or device that was helping a man get in touch with his own morality. And if he discovered, yes, that he was a CO, but he didn't know that he could speak up and say, I don't want to fight. So she was over and over again looking for what more she could do. The next anecdote is, you know, a moment ago I was giving this image of 3,000 people, multi-nation gathering of Native people. I had mixed with Frances where there were 1,000 of us, 1,000 women. It was 1983 in New York State. And in Romulus near Seneca, there was this army depot that had Pershing and cruise missiles. This was August, and they were slated in the fall to be sent to Europe. So we all were joining to stop them from being sent. It was for us really serious. Frances and I were in an affinity group of 6 women, and we did a parade, the whole group. So it's called Seneca Women's Encampment. There's wonderful photographic books about this time. But I want to tell you this moment that happened to Frances. So we're trying to parade into the base. Instead, the fence goes up. So the gate is closed. And if you know Andrea Vazian, you know, again, you feel like her spirit in this. Andrea said, well, I'm going to go over the fence. There's a famous picture of Frances, but here's what happened beforehand. Andrea said, we just put like a coat or something to block the sharpness. And Frances said, even though she, you know, she was at that point 63, she had a lot of exercise, but she said something in her said, I'm not sure I can go over. So she decided to do it. I remember looking up at her. I held her knee, and a group of us were like steady and pushing her. And what happened is she said in this book, it's really interesting, that climb over the wall moved my commitment to a more profound understanding of the depths of my radical soul. Before I give you one more anecdote, let's hear directly Frances's voice. Again, in this book that's available, Finding My Radical Soul. Frances said, you know, I didn't start out as a peace activist. It's an identity bestowed on me by others. There's nothing extraordinary about me. What I have done is something that anybody can do. I consider, work, and act. I like to think of my life as the development of my conscience. Being exposed to things is what is important. I feel that you live your life, this is a really interesting thing, not so much as the way opens ahead of you, but as the way closes in behind you. Therefore, you have to be aware of and pay attention to what is going on in the world. Well, let's look at Frances and the Stop It Now affinity group. And one of the things that's really exciting about her long legacy is over and over again, but sometimes like a newspaper reporter. So for example, in 2013, the affinity group called Shut It Down, she was 93, but I want to say the names of other women who were part of it: Hattie Nessel, Pocky Whelan, Nancy First, Betsy Corner, Ellen Graves. So she would want all those names said today. Another action witness, the publisher of that book, Anika Corbett. So between 2005 and 2014, when the Shut It Down affinity group was a big part of shutting down the Vernon nuclear reactor, they did 40 demonstrations, 40. They were a steady presence trespassing at the reactor and at the headquarters. You can learn more at the film by Robbie Lepser called Power Struggle from his Turning Tide films. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share the screen, and I'm going to attempt to be setting it up and talking at the same time. And all right so far. Aha. Now what we're going to do is go to the next picture. So you'll notice that this isn't Frances, but Doug asked me to make sure that we thank all the people who were part of this action. This is a picture of Rima Loeb. She is one of the many protectors who volunteered to be arrested. This photo of the Sandisk protest, let me just quickly put back the one we saw earlier that's also Sandisk, where Doug was identifying the sacred sites. These two photos were taken by Liz McLaughlin, our technician today. Liz was involved in a central way in the Sandisk protest and the lengthy fundraising. So in our theme of today's talk, Women in the Land, we see women pulling together and stepping forward. So Doug would also like to thank Kate Woolner. Kate is the co-founder of the Sugar Shack Alliance, the non-direct action protest group against fossil fuels. Kate was key in helping people be there in Sandisk for the protest. More names. Susan Theberge. Susan Theberge leads Climate Action Now. She was a protester at that time and also a fundraiser for the action through her group. Let's thank Rose Wessel, founder of No Fracked Gas in Mass. Let's thank Katie Eisman, founder of the Massachusetts Pipeline Awareness Network. I think of these thank yous in a ceremonial way. This relates to Dr. Lisa Brooks telling us there are leadership networks, all these people. Lisa Brooks talks about the rhizome actions, like roots underneath the ground. I put forth these names, but I wanted to just give that sense of how we're holding them. Mickey McKinley, Emily Volz, Julia Blythe, Jenny Tufts, and the lawyer who Doug mentioned, Anne-Marie Garty. We also thank the water protectors who came all the way from Standing Rock to join in. They brought a reverence to the courtroom. lighting a piece of sandalwood and sitting quietly praying as they were in court and also in jail. Arif Brandt says, protester is a colonial term. Protector is the word we use. It is through prayer and ceremonial act that decolonization can be achieved. As I stop sharing the screen, I want to go now to the closing that I have ready of this talk. And then after that, we will have question and answers. Let's go back to the day of mourning. One of the central banners at the day of mourning says, we are not vanishing. We are not conquered. We are as strong as ever. I want to thank again Howard Clark and his work recovering Wissatinawag. Mashalisque would have been there. I want to thank again Dr. Margaret Bruchac for bringing in the vision of what was happening in 1704 and making sure that Native voices are fully seen. And thank Dr. Lisa Brooks. There's a book by John Sinton called Devil's Den to Licking Water. It reminds me to say something that Doug and I have talked about. So I'm an interfaith minister, and one of my passions is helping to take part in a horrific takeover. And that is when you see different places that have given the name devil, that's a colonizer name. So it was so important, David, as you were talking about that work of John Elliott and this, this religious takeover, because this is just like so hard to face, that Habamak was this positive force in this valley, native spirit being, sacred being. And they asked and demanded Nipmuc people to turn him into a devil because they said, we can't rescue you, we can't take you unless you think of things in terms of a devil. It was just, so let's all be part of taking that, changing that over. Let us also gather the names of Native women. There are Native women who are well known. Witamu, her sister, Wutanusk, Warabita, and her mother, Nasquaqua, in the Cascoak area that's now called Casco Bay. But also in that book by John Sinton, I'm going to read one of several names that I harvested from that book. And this is a really interesting passage. So we're going to hold this name because she is someone that probably we here didn't know her name before this moment. Daughter of Suanet, her name is Asogwa, Asogoa. It says about her, she was made to sign a deed of 3,000 acres belonging to a Pocumtuck sachem. When we don't speak these names and seek for their stories, it is at everyone's peril. If we don't see how we all fit together, then we can't really belong in this place. And this talk is about reclaiming. If we reach back, we can get a depth, a new depth we need to change how things are going. Women were the guardians. Women held communities together. We reclaim that role in a network of leadership cooperation. We need to see Mashalisque. We need to stand with Frances. I wish I could read the accurate words of Mashalisque, and that's the grief we hold. But we can read the words Frances Crowe. She said, "I only regret is that I didn't do more. You need to resist and take courage to move ahead as your conscience leads. You need to let your conscience crystallize and grow and peel off the layers and get to what is the core of yourself. Rejoice in life and act." Thank you.
So we are now moving into the question and answer period. Please remember to use your raised hand feature. And Lise McLaughlin, our technician, will unmute you as you signal the desire to ask a question. So you'll be addressing Doug or Sarah. Thank you.
Okay, Dusty, you can go ahead and ask your question. Unmute yourself.
That was a mistake. I don't, sorry.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Just a second. Dusty has done this really important books. So this is better than a mistake. Will you tell everybody about the work you've done that relates to Frances Crowe, please?
Okay, you need to unmute again. Dusty, if you want to.
Okay, I'm sorry.
There you go. You're good now. Go ahead.
Heather asked me to say something about this. First
Yeah.
of all, this is a wonderful program. I've learned so much. But what she's referring to is that Frances collaborated with me in being the role model for a mystery series based on a woman who looks and sounds and thinks a great deal like Frances Crowe, who takes on social justice issues.
And environmental.
And environmental issues and nuclear power issues and the pipeline and so on. And Frances was a wonderful friend to me for many years, but in the end of her life and just recently in mine, this is something we did gleefully together. So I always love hearing about Frances, and I love what I've learned from Doug and Sarah today. So thank you so much.
How could somebody get that book, Dusty?
They're all available. If you go to my website, you can go to my publisher.
Say your website address.
DustyJMiller.com. And they're the Alice Ott Mystery Series. And they have pictures of Frances on the cover. And I'm writing the 5th one. And it moves from Western Massachusetts to Florida. And Dorothy Cresswell and I, who are partners, have been learning about.
Oops. Sounds like we lost Dusty's connection. I'm going to the next person. Dan, if you would like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, my question's for Sarah. My name's Dan Shears. I'm an enrolled member of the Nulhegan Abenaki of Vermont. I was wondering where I could see the stone. I'm going to say it's corn mortar because you had talked about a depression in the stone. So I'm going to assume that was for grinding corn.
Oh, I've so long wanted to be able to talk to somebody about the stones. What you would do, there's a website for Woolman Hill. It's named after a Quaker, WOOL, Woolman Hill. And it's a public area. You would talk to Margaret, who directs it, and ask how to find the ridge trail up to the top. And then as you go along the ridge trail, you will see it, but you'd be heading south along the ridge. And also welcome to contact me. I would so much like to learn from you if you want to do a hike up there.
Okay. The next person is Andy. If you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to ask your question. Go ahead. Andy, we can't hear you. Okay, moving on to the next person, Kate. If you would like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hi, thank you all, Grandfather Doug and Sarah Pirtle. I wanted to just say that hearing you say a good debt or a bad debt, I had not quite heard those phrasings before, and that just was that was helpful, because I do always want what I do in my day to pass on something that's good for the future generations, but to also actually, it just gave me another level of being conscious, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Andy, do you want to try again? No? Okay, there are some questions that are typed into the Q&A. The first one is again from Kate. She says, I am not an historian, but I believe that I have heard that Pynchon also used getting English settler men in debt in order to do things like attack indigenous people or sites. Would either of you like to address that question?
I'd like to draw upon the work of Howard Clark. Howard Clark said that at the time of Pynchon's death, a third of the people in that area were indebted to him, and half were working for him. Nobody could buy or trade but him. So it was so deliberate. And he used alcohol as part of the land grab, getting people drunk. Howard thinks that when the son Watawolinskyn of Mashalisque broke the windows of John Pynchon's home, it might have been accidental, but it's also talked about that he might have got him in drunk, or maybe he was just furious at him. It's one of these things we don't know.
Okay. Here's a question from Don Campbell. He says, this is a question for Doug. Is there special meaning of places where different streams have sources near each other?
There would be special meaning. The ancestors would have acknowledged those places. Water has always been a powerful spirit. And where streams come together or where they diverge, that is always given full acknowledgement spiritually. Does that answer your question?
Oh, somebody typed something else.
Please, can I jump in?
Please do, David.
Yeah, in specific reference to Don's question, he's a resident of Northfield. And I don't know if I shared this with him, but there was a time when Lise, Doug, myself, and a few other people were stumbling around an area where the Kinder Morgan transfer station was going to be, right? And as we were walking along, we came to a fascinating site where 3 streams came together, Don, and 5 streams came together. I remembered 3. 5 streams came together, at which there were significant stone groupings. A couple of Manitou stones, stone. I recall a rock with a cleft that was filled with small pebbles and stone. So to your question, it's right in your backyard somewhere.
Andy writes, I would like to hear more about Sarah's intention not to guess the intentions of Mashalisque, as I heard it. With that in mind, what is a good way to express empathetic regard for the experience of Indigenous people in history?
Well, let's let that question ring out for those of us who are descendants of colonizers, because it's something that it's a clue that I got when I was first working with getting to know history about Mashalisque. I really wanted to feel into what must have been going on when she was made to sign the deed. And then one day as I was taking a walk, I realized that it wasn't my territory to enter. So that's a clue I have right now. Is this Andy Grant? Because Andy is the person that I spoke of has gone to Day of Mourning and really carries these questions very carefully. He brought people together at Woolman Hill during the Peace Pagoda walk. And one of the things that happened is that we stood there and we thought about Mashalisque together.
There's a sort of a question from Anne-Marie Gardy.
Oh, great.
But I don't see a question. It just says, this is for David. Anne-Marie, if you would like to ask your question, you can unmute yourself and do that. Or not. The next question is.
If I might just respond, to know that Anne-Marie is watching. Anne-Marie crafted the tribal perspective into language that would be acceptable and understandable by the courts. And she has been a very powerful interpreter of tribal perspective to the federal level. They didn't, given the Trump era, they did not allow us to come and present. However, what the communication did in the court documents that Anne-Marie crafted was to let the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and all other federal agencies know that they are being watched. The National Historic Preservation Act does matter. And if the state won't respond, if the tribes won't respond, then by golly, the people will stand up and respond as is their public right. Anne-Marie, thank you. Thank you for being here with us. And I'm sorry that your voice could not be heard.
Well, I think I figured out how to unmute myself. I have my settings with my microphone off, so you can hear me. Nod, yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. So I had a question for David, actually. You mentioned that there was someone who wanted to keep rights, land rights for the indigenous people, and that they could use the land even though the deed transferred the property. Was that written in the deed, or where did you find that?
Yeah, I've got the quote right here just for general knowledge, but it also was part of the deed that Chalk signed off. Let me just locate it. It'll take a second.
Should we sneak in a question while you're looking that up, David?
I've got it right here, so I'll just say, I'll go really quickly, okay?
Okay.
The deed this is what I wrote in the Montague Reporter about a month ago. The deed that Chalk signed does indicate at least some intention to preserve usage rights, in that on the deed he wrote, doth reserve the liberty of fishing for ye Indians in your rivers or waters, or free liberty to hunt deer and other wild creatures, and to gather walnuts, chestnuts, and other nuts, things, etc. on ye commons. So that was in, it's in George Sheldon's book on the history of Deerfield, but it's also, he copied that word for word from the pension deed that Chalk signed off on, okay?
And that deed was for 8,000 acres or a smaller parcel?
Probably a smaller part, because what I was able to glean was there were overlapping deeds, and they, many of them were signed in Springfield without anybody ever having gone out and checked out the lands. And so it's kind of, again, even Sheldon writes that in his book, saying, you know, what they were up to is very hard to tell, because they didn't seem to regard any points of the compass or any significant landmarks in a lot of these deeds. But whatever chunk he signed off on, I don't have all that information at my fingertips, but it is in the Sheldon book.
Okay, maybe you'll have Doug contact us. I'd like to follow up on that.
Yeah, okay, very good. Nice to hear from you.
You too.
Yes. The next question is from Jackie, who typed in the Q&A, what indigenous uses of the land would still be possible now? Hunting, growing, the Three Sisters, I would presume, forest management, fires, creation of openings. Seems related to Anne Marie's question.
Yeah. You know, I can only give my own personal opinion. It would be wonderful, but chances are 400 years have gone by or so, 340, 50. It'd be a real challenge. I don't know if Doug has a thought on that, but
Well, I think that Chalk gave us purposes for land, and some of those purposes would still exist. So I know that I will be looking for places where nuts grow, and I will be looking for the right to ceremonially present myself and others to be there in Chalk's name to harvest those.
Yep, it's a really good point. Excellent.
Okay. The next
Ask
question.
about plug.
Oh, we're gonna let Andy ask a question. If he's figured out how to talk, go ahead.
Well, is this Andy Grant related to the Grants in Cherokee?
No.
Oh, okay. All right. Because there is one of the sons is an Andrew, is an Andy.
Oh.
Okay. Andy, you want to try and ask a question? Okay, still not working. We'll give Max a chance. Max, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. And I'm from the Recorder, Greenfield Recorder, by the way. This is for Doug or Sarah or David, whoever wants to speak to this. I'm just curious if you guys can talk a bit more about how Mashalisque and John Pynchon, how that whole transaction kind of figured into the way the land, into the lay of the land, as it is now and as it historically, settled out. Was this like, was that I'm not clear on like how big of a a piece of land that was, and I'm curious if those boundaries are still things that are recognized today, or if that's if things have changed again since then.
Max, one of the things you can do is to look up the deed online these days, and it goes all the way to the Connecticut River, Quinnipiac River. So the first deed in 72, that was the one that really covered Deerfield. So it's a huge area. And then the second deed, and at that point it says that Mashalisque is living on the east side of the river, because Woolman Hill, that area, that's the west side. So that's the one where there's been a making of a river walk along there by the Sunderland community was part of creating. So they're trying to start recognizing, and that was huge. That's Leverett, Montague, Sunderland were all part of that granting. I know that Andy Grant is part of a group at the Mount Toby meeting that's taking that really seriously, because they're in Leverett and they're looking at what does repair look like. I found the piece of paper I wanted to say earlier about Andy Grant, that so the Peace Pagoda that's in Leverett made a 5-year commitment. It's called Listening to the Call of the Great Spirit, Facing 400 Years of Colonization Since Mayflower Landing and Walking into the Future. So this year they did their final walk, and they ended at Great Falls. That was one of their stops. The Trap Rock Center for Peace and Justice on the website has 6 pages about that walk if someone wanted to learn more.
I can chip in something for Max. I've referred a lot to The History of Montague by Edward Pressey, which is probably in most libraries. But your question kind of rang a bell, and I'm looking at page 55, and it talks about, of course, nowadays, all the place names have changed, and that makes it really pretty fascinating. But it basically says that she sold and alienated a tract of land to John Pynchon, which land begins at the southerly end of the brook Neposoneag, taking in all the land on the northerly side. It runs up the Quinnipiac to the brook called Sawatapetuwas and Matamunash, where the Indians have sold the whole tract of land from Neposoneag on the south. Next, Hadley bounds to Sawatapesquas on the north, and from the Connecticut River out into the woods eastwards 6 miles from the river. So there's a lot, all those place names I lament, they're lost. They obviously meant something in terms of a beautiful poetry, a poetry about the landscape. These places should still respond to their native names they had for 10,000 years, but we don't know. But anyway, you will find that kind of documentation in, as Sarah said, in the actual deeds, but also a quicker way is just to get to the library and get out The History of Montague, and you'll find a really good example of a number of ways of describing where that went. And like Sarah said, yeah, along the Sunderland side of the river, there's a very short river walk that Sarah and I helped dedicate when it was first opened almost 2 summers ago, I guess. So anyway, there's a lot of information there.
This program has created an opportunity in the hearts and minds of everyone who's listened and participated to be open to the Spirit when it calls you. Because each of you who is listening to this program and watching this program will in some way be asked to step forward and redress these wrongs. So just keep yourself and your heart and your spirit open, because your time will come when it will be your turn to do the right thing, to deal with this debt.
The next question is from Diane, and it's for Doug. What is the significance of the Pleiades and ceremonial stone features at this time of year? Please describe.
Well, in traditional belief, the movement of the Perseids through the atmosphere had to do with the travel of spirits to the closing place in the west. The Pleiades are associated with planting, and we are informed by the Frenchmen who came here and met with the Narragansett, and we are also informed by Roger Williams, who met with the Narragansett, that the Pleiades signal the time for corn planting. These are just one of the communications from the heavens that we know of. Did you have a response to that, Sarah?
Happiness. it's to be able to see how people saw so that we can get the vision again means a lot. Thank you.
Next question is from Jackie, who asks, any estimates of population in what now gets called Pioneer Valley before and after smallpox swept through? And when did smallpox sweep through?
I can take a stab at the estimated population. What I've read, a lot of times, and even in the Smithsonian Institute of Native American Indians, I forget the name exactly, but a lot of times they based the population estimates on the number of warriors. And what I have read is that the Pocumtuck, which was in some ways considered a confederation that reached, at least of the Algonquian people, reached from Northfield. I don't think it included the Abenaki in Northfield, although they were allies, but it reached all the way down through Windsor, Connecticut, including the Podunk and Tunxus tribes. But anyway, the estimates were 2,000 to 3,000 warriors. And you would have to assume that behind each of those warriors were tribal members, a number of people. I have read in the same Smithsonian book that the Narragansett were probably the most numerous of warriors in the Northeast, and they had easily 5,000 to 6,000 warriors prior to the epidemics. I think the coastal tribes, Doug might be able to speak to this, but the coastal tribes were more prone to the epidemics and the deadly toll than were the River Valley Indians, although clearly the River Indians suffered from that as well. But I'm quite sure that we could say that when Pynchon was trying to take the lands away by hook or by crook, that there were a good 5,000 to 6,000 tribal people living between Wequamps and the Falls.
I won't challenge that estimate.
Okay. The next question is from Thomas, who asks, how can conservation groups consider and honor Native people?
I think it's important that Thomas answer the question himself, because the opportunities for doing so will rise, and they have risen and will rise and rise again. And what you have to do is to then ask that question and then provide the answer. The many places get named erroneously, and there is the opportunity to reach back into the history and select an appropriate, more appropriate name. But it's in the hearts and minds of the people, you, the public. What will you choose to do once you understand that there is something that needs to be done? What will you do? How will you reach out and claim the moment you're in to address appropriately the future and the present?
I might add a couple of land trusts that are very close to all of our hearts. Certainly out here in the central part of the valley, the Mount Grace Land Trust and the Franklin Land Trust. These are people who have nothing but the public interest in mind, and they would be a conservation-minded person like yourself, or if you're interested in righting some wrongs or finding different names, these people would be incredibly open to that kind of initiative. The timing is right now is incredible. The interest in underserved populations, especially Native Americans, is huge right now. So this is the time.
There's a question from Rochelle for Doug. Can you talk about the importance of preservation of ancient sites for our future?
Well, depending on the type of site, many of the stone sites are actually prayers. And so the ancestors would speak a prayer into a stone and place it. And we know not only from tribal sources, but from colonial sources, like Ezra Stiles, president of Yale University, who said that he would be walking with an Indian, and that Indian would walk often a quarter of a mile out of the way, not to have to go to a place or near a place where he would have to get a stone and speak a prayer. So many of these that are still in the woods are prayers and should be left alone, are prayers that are still calling forth to the Mother Earth for balance and harmony. And what we need to understand is that these stones are there, and they're there for a purpose. They should be left alone. They should be guarded. They should be protected. And we have to make sure that, as happened in the case with Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they had the opportunity to halt. They were shown by contemporary tribal people where the ceremonial stones were, given maps, and then they chose to ignore that process. And so it was not until the public stepped forward with its voice and protested that that became a newspaper article, became a radio program, became a television show. And the spotlight was placed on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And through the work with Anne Marie Gardy, it exists as documents in federal language that addresses all of the wrongdoings of the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and all other federal agencies should be aware and on notice that the public will not forgive them.
Doug, in that spirit, the black stones that I mentioned on the spine of the mountain, it feels important to be able to know whether we should give them kind of privacy, how can we give respect to those?
Well, if in each and every individual that respect exists, then it will be communicated to other people. Yes, signs can be put up, but what does a sign do if in fact people don't back up what's on the sign? It has to be in our hearts, and we have to take what's in our hearts seriously and communicate it to those we know.
Someone else asks, is there a way to recognize one of the stones you mentioned, Doug?
If your spirit is open, you'll be called to it. But in terms of giving you a definition of what to look for, I'm not at liberty to do that. But if you ask, when you walk through the woods, if you ask to be guided so that you don't mistakenly abuse a stone feature that is ceremonial, it'll come to you.
Someone asks, are there any concentrated classes or studies that teach about planting by Indigenous practices, and could those be accessed at community colleges for sustainable studies students?
Well, the answer has to be yes. To who you can be directed toward, I would say first go to, there is a book written by a woman whose last name is Kimmerer. And she can be gotten to lecture, or her book can be read. I don't recall her first name. Her maiden name is
Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Robin Wall Kimmerer, thank you. But she has been a great, she's Potawatomi, and she's also a university professor where she teaches botany. So she writes the book from a botanist perspective, talking Indian language.
So we have a couple people who have already asked a question, but I would like to ask another question. Is that okay with the speakers?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to ask Max. You can unmute and ask your question. Or might not be there. Okay. Kate, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, this is actually a response to many things that have been said. And as a descendant of people that are settler, I think that in this time, it's very exciting because we can ask land conservancies, land trusts, and different organizations, can they reawaken the land use agreements that are indigenous to this area, which is shared gathering. So maybe we can reawaken some of these agreements. Well, not maybe, we can. So I just wanted to share that inspiration that I've been wanting to share to the community.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how welcome are European Americans at gatherings among, for example, the Nipmuc or other groups in the modern day? And how can these European Americans find out where and when they might be welcome?
Most tribal organizations, most tribes have a website. And I would suggest that what you bring is what you end up being responded to as. Whether or not you can be positively related to a powwow or a ceremonial event, I would simply say, contact the website, ask the question, ask to be invited.
Pam Kelly has a comment. There are many opportunities to come to the aid of our collective well-being in the name of Mother Earth. I would like to ask David Brule to talk about the way the Nolambika Project is addressing our common crisis on pollinator destruction, and could either Doug or David address the despair from the destruction of burial indigenous burial grounds, such as near the site of the Narragansett and Pecumtuck massacres in Montague.
Go ahead, David.
Okay, I can certainly mention one or two things about what the Nolambika Project is doing, and it's very close to a number of us, especially Pam, who asked the question. Is a great question. And so what we have done is develop a pollinator protection program with the help of a local pollinator expert, Tom Sullivan. And we have developed a program whereby we visit schools. And we have partnered with a couple of schools, the Four Rivers School in Greenfield, school in Mohawk regional area. Let's see, Irving Elementary. Anyways, we have a three-pronged approach in which we have a bit of a age-appropriate scientific element in our program presented to the students these days via Zoom or via video. We have then an indigenous person come and join us and tell some stories that would be related to the protection of nature, the interaction of the human and non-human world. And then we have a hands-on project. So we've been doing this for a couple of years. Things have worked out really well. Of course, is what with the health emergency, it's kind of put things out of kilter a little bit. But that's what the Nolambika Project is doing. We've had, through the help of Pam and a number of other people that are very close to this, Dorothea Sotiros being one also, and Diane Dix, we've managed to land a lot of grants to help fund. We are basically a pass-through organization. We find the money and we engage specialists, especially indigenous people, to be part of it. So we've done a lot of projects with kids, planting seed balls and various things on Wissatinawag and in school gardens. And so that's basically what we do. And in terms of addressing the despair, I'm just such an optimistic person. I just have no despair in my vocabulary. So I just have a positive outlook that things are going to work out for the best. I know that, if I might just say, I think the individual effort is incredibly important. We started this with a land acknowledgement. That's a very small thing that carries a lot of weight. If we had a lot of organizations, if we had a lot of individuals before they said anything in a public forum were to mention the acknowledging the fact that we are benefiting from land that was taken from the indigenous people, I think that would be huge. A very small step that each of us could do. So, yeah, I'll back off the despair question, but I'm not. It's not in my nature to be desperate.
People are.
It is my responsibility to do ceremony to my ancestors, and by ceremony, in more contemporary terms, to pray to them, to ask for guidance. And I would suggest that for each of us, whether you are indigenous or whether you are of colonial ancestry, or if your ancestors came post-colonization. Call on your ancestors and ask for insights. Call on your ancestors and ask to be told what you need to know and what you need to do. Your ancestors, especially if they are colonial, know the stories, know the process, know what wrongs need to be righted, and can share that with you, can give you those insights in ways that you can't even begin to imagine. You may end up talking to somebody in a store, and that person all of a sudden starts telling you about stuff that you don't even know about, but that may have to do with you, because that's how ancestors work. They work through which opportunities present themselves. A book may arrive that tells you what you need to know, but you may meet someone who begins to tell you the story of you that you haven't begun to even imagine. So you got to reach out. You got to be open. You've got to ask for advice. And if you ask for advice, it will be given.
I think
Can I
Sarah
add
had
can I add
something to add.
a quick PS to Doug's statement? I love a statement that Doug gave us many years ago. You will understand when you are ready. Doug always has said that. The ancestors reach out to you, but when you're ready, you will understand.
Sometimes people said, what's part of a land acknowledgement? The very start of the Nolambika website, has a land acknowledgement that people can use, adopt, bring into their hearts.
Okay, so we're going to take one more question, and then Doug and Sarah will both have a chance to close out. And then David's going to do the final closing. So the last question is from Don. He says, for Doug, under what circumstances is a name change to Indigenous names matter to the people, and when should we better spend effort on other things?
That's a very simple and very complex question. A name change is whenever you feel it is appropriate. And that's for both a name change for a person or a name change for a place. When you feel it is appropriate and when your spirit insists that you move that forward, then do it. Otherwise, there is no significance, because change must be followed by action. It must be followed by action, with action. And so if you're not prepared to follow up, don't get it started. But if you're prepared to follow up, then know that the support will be there for you for whatever you sense needs to be done.
Okay, so I apologize to those whose questions didn't get fit in. Doug, would you like to give a closing statement before we end?
Oh, I would only state in the language that I've been trained in, Tao ban tantamuk uchi wame. We are giving thanks for all things. And what that means is we're giving thanks for those things that we welcomed, and we're giving thanks to those things which we did not welcome, would not want, but lead us in a proper direction. So Tao ban tantamuk uchi wame. We're giving thanks for all things.
Thank you. And Sarah, do you have a closing statement you'd like?
I want to bring us into something that I've learned to see really from listening to Doug and to David and the others I mentioned, just feeling the reality of this exchange place coming to the river, that we're in this tradition of what are we called to do together? What can we offer each other? I find that when I think of Great Falls, and I think of what I learned from Joe Gravelin. He said, when that moment of the massacre, it was like a great light was turned off. So how do we turn the light back on through our collaboration and our hearts and our intentions?
And finally, David, as Nolambika president, has the final word to close us out.
That's great. Thank you. I was just going to say good night all, but Sarah gave me a thought because she evoked the story at the falls. And I would like to say again, with the brighter looking to the future, that part of that healing that is taking place, part of that has been Doug. Part of that has been people like Joe Gravelin and Howard Clark, Diane, and all of the people who are part of Nolambika. Wissatinawag was saved from turning into a Walmart. The Doug Harris, Running Wolf, Wilcox, numerous tribal entities participated in a reconciliation ceremony in 2004. A few years later, the Ceremonial Hill at the Turners Falls Airport was saved and was dedicated in all of our minds as an important site to be honored. Within years, 2 years, Doug Harris, Paul Robinson, myself, we landed a grant to study the massacre. All of these things are starting to be part of the healing. Doug himself said that the people who were caught at the falls, at the moment of their greatest torment, their spirits are being released. Not that we have to carry around a dark feeling over us. We have worked to help release them. Now we have to do more. Now the work, as Doug said, is here to be done. And so that would be my closing. What I would want to leave with people is that we are moving forward ever since that unlocking of the bad medicine and bad energy at the falls. And I think it's part of the past now. We'll never forget it. We always will have our ceremony of remembrance in the vicinity of May 19th. So I'm closing with that. I want to thank everyone and all the people from the Nolambika Project, and especially Lise McLaughlin, who has been outstanding in her technical work, and it was a great help, I know, to helping get Doug to be part of this. And so on behalf of the Nolambika Project, thank you all for attending. Thank you for your patience. We're running way over, which is wonderful, a great indication of a great success. This is the last event of the River Stories 2020 Recovering Indigenous Voices for the year, and it is the celebration of the Beaver Moon. Full moon is coming up, and so good night all, and thank you very much for having participated. Bye now.